LisbonTalks Universidade Lusófona. Conversations around the diversity of Portuguese cinema and the festival's focuses and retrospectives. In this edition, dedicated to new trends, subgenres, and ways of making cinema.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. Oh, I can hear myself, it's horrible. Thank you for coming. I just wondered, actually, I was going to ask first how much you guys know about Wishman, or has anyone here seen any of the films so far? I just want to work out what sort of level we should be talking at. Okay, some big fans, okay. I'm very happy to be here with Peggy and Lisa, who are both coming from quite different directions in terms of their engagement with Doris's work, and I personally hadn't seen that many of Wishman's films before being asked to do this, so it was a great chance to dive into them in these very beautifully restored versions, thanks in part to Lisa's work. I've been reading a bit about sexploitation in general, and I wanted to draw a bit on our mutual friend and colleague Elena Gorfinkel's work in introducing Ahwesh and Petrucci. So of Ahwesh, Elena says, in terms of her relationship to Wishman, Ahwesh's perspicacity. Oh, this is actually about the zine that Ahwesh, that Peggy, what am I calling it? This is about the zine that Peggy put together. Do you have a copy that you can show? Oh, it's here. Okay, so so Elena writes on that zine. Ahwesh's perspicacity in reviving and considering Wishman's significance to film history allows us to recognize these two queens, and here she's talking about Peggy and Doris, as bricoleurs who cut and are cut from the same cloth. They are montagists and resuscitators of scraps and fragments, shapers of women's most complicated gestures and states of feeling, exploiters of the paradoxes of capitalist patriarchy that itself exploits sensations, bodies, and consumer goods. And Elena on Lisa talks about something weird, which is the, how would you describe it?
It's the reason I'm doing anything about Doris Wishman.
Okay, so
I should have
yeah, you introduce that.
Something Weird Video was founded in 1990 by my late husband, Mike Franey. He passed away in 2014. I met Mike in 1993 because I was a fan of Doris Wishman and Roberta Finley, and I met him at a horror convention, and the rest is history. I mean, I've been involved with Something Weird ever since then, so.
Yeah, so just to finish my scrappy introduction, Elena says of Something Weird that the work of intrepid collectors and enthusiasts, as well as that for non-for-profit video businesses with a vested interest such as Something Weird, has immeasurably reconstituted the history of sexploitation at the level of access and what can be watched and rewatched. So I wanted to first start off by asking you both if you remember how you first encountered Doris's work, and maybe what film brought you into her oeuvre.
Well, probably the first Doris Wishman film I watched was Bad Girls Go to Hell. And I used to live in New York City, right near Kim's Video, which was one of, pretty much if you wanted to get an education in exploitation film, Kim's Video was the place to go, because they had everything. I think at one point Quentin Tarantino was a clerk there when he was younger and stuff. But there was one section of Kim's Video that when I started going there was probably the late 1980s. It had films that I'd never heard of, and there were these very garish covers on these VHS boxes, and I was I immediately gravitated to them and didn't know anything about the films, and one of them was Bad Girls Go to Hell. And when I found out that a woman directed it, it really just blew my mind, first of all, because I was just learning about sexploitation cinema at the time, and I don't know, I felt a kinship with Doris, and at that point I needed to see as many films that had been on VHS, because it was the late 80s and early 90s, and there weren't that many. Some of the biggest titles like Nude on the Moon, Bad Girls Go to Hell, Double Agent 73 and Deadly Weapons were out there, but a lot of the minor titles weren't, so that was pretty much where I stopped until 1993 when I met Mike at a chiller convention, and he just started sending me like, oh, if you like Doris Wishman, here's some other ones. And, you know, within a year I was living in Seattle and working for Something Weird. So that's my story.
I too went to Kim's Video in the East Village in that same time period, and it's amazing that we weren't friends then. Is because it's kind of a small world in New York. Doris's the covers of Doris's videotapes and the titles and the ad campaigns for her movies were extraordinary, really. And it wasn't. In a way, they were part of the genre of sexploitation films, but it was something she took to a high art. And when she basically would come up with an idea, and then and it would make her come up with the title. So the title came first, like The Immoral Three. Like regardless of how the movie turned out, the title would set The Immoral Three, or all of her films. And then she did, she wrote a script and did an ad campaign. That was what she did before she even shot the movies. So she was completely aware of this marketing, the importance of the marketing, but also it stimulated her imagination to kind of have a whole concept kind of wrapped up in a title. But in the late 80s and early 90s, I went to Kim's Video. I was really dedicated to Something Weird Video, a really important resource, and continues to be. And I think it's important to note, not just, because those guys are really obsessed with the movies, but I think it's really important to think that a couple of individuals basically saved an incredible amount of film history that was under the radar and really preserved it and kept it going and advertised it and wrote extensively about it and now preserving it. I just want to say about Something Weird that is really, really important work. And and really with just a few individuals can really make a big difference. It's like a cliche, but in this case, it's really true. So I was with the crowd. We all collected VHS tapes and always on the lookout for something unusual. And so Doris, I latched onto Doris pretty early on and obsessed with her pretty much throughout the 90s.
I wanted to ask about the 90s as that moment, because I guess this is when you first started working in a more hands-on way as part of Something Weird with Doris's work. And you also did a retrospective, or you showed some of her films at was it San Francisco and at the Roxy Cinema. So I was wondering why you think at the 90s, whether you see that as her first sort of period of recuperation or being brought into circles that were maybe less niche or cult, and why was this more to do with the circulation of VHS or audience sensibilities? Why do you think the 90s might have been a time when people were different audiences were being brought into Doris's work?
Well, as far as the 90s, a lot of stuff had never come out on home video. I mean, they were considered lost films or rare films or whatever. You got to assume that, so with the VHS format was pretty much like the go-to up until about 1999. And we were fortunate enough at Something Weird to be able to, I'm going to tell you a really funny story now, how we even got the Doris Wishman collection. Mike Franey, my husband, had been a bootlegger before starting Something Weird Video. And he would take, pre-recorded VHS tapes and sell them out on the, fan market. So there were all these fanzines, and there weren't websites back then, but these ways that anybody who was into genre film, they didn't call it that back then, but that's what we call it now, could find out about things. And it ended up that, he just decided, he didn't think anybody was paying any attention, so he's like, I'm going to put these out, and there's ads you can see from fanzines from the 90s with Bad Girls Go to Hell, Double Agent 73, Deadly Weapons. I mean, all these ones that he should not have been selling. Well, he gets a phone call one day from Jimmy Maslin, and he's a guy who lives in LA. He bought all of Doris's films from her in the 80s, and he was the one that actually did all of those big box VHS releases that happened in the late 80s, early 90s. And he's like, hey, you're selling my movies and you're on permission. And, you know, Mike was always wanting to smooth things over. He's like, yeah, and people really love them. He goes, you want to make a licensing deal? And that's how we ended up with, like, the entire Doris Wishman collection up to Let Me Die a Woman. We don't have the films later than that, although we do sell one of her porno movies called Come With Me, My Love as Haunted Pussy. So anyway, so that was how something weird got into the thing with Doris Wishman. But as far as the 90s go, I mean, it was probably the most exciting time to be in home video. Especially if you were just like, you know, almost like a treasure hunter. Because, I mean, nowadays anybody can just go on Google and be like, I want to watch blah, 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 and like find it. I mean, it was like a treasure hunt back then to find films that you hadn't seen before. And I don't know, the enthusiasm and the writing that was being done back then, it was more from just like a astonishment point of view, as opposed to later where like these films have been out there for a little while and people were starting to recognize them as maybe historically important, and, you know, academics started writing about them and stuff. So that's, you know, that was what I thought of the 90s. But I want to hear what Peggy has to say.
I hope we don't knock over this.
Yeah, move on.
Well, I hate to make this admission, but I'm going to. When I read the reminiscences about like Doris Wishman rediscovery in the early 90s and her life in Florida, they always refer to me as an academic. And I was like kind of insulted actually by that. But it's true that I sometimes wear that hat. I'm a filmmaker, but I've taught. I taught for 30 years, and so I do have, you know, kind of and I've read some theory now and then. But and I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just like a little bit like weird that that all the bands were into Doris, and, you know, this exploitation, you know, filmmakers that were hanging around Miami, and people came to the sex shop, and Peggy Ahwesh, the academic. So I was like, okay, whatever. But, you know, immediately when I saw Doris Wishman films, I was like, there is something really moving here and really unusual. And I recognized her first as a woman filmmaker, and that there was something unique about the point of view in the movies. I mean, it's kind of absurd, like, I don't think most feminists can really get behind the idea that the woman who's made the most films is a sexploitation filmmaker named Doris Wishman. And then the person who made maybe the most important films historically was a Nazi, Leni Riefenstahl. It's like hard for feminists to kind of get behind these two figures.
It's not true that she's the one that made the most.
No, Doris? Doris in the United States. Well, I should never say the most of anything, but we could argue this point. Maybe
She was very prolific.
maybe Danny has another take on this, but I think that it's an interesting conundrum in women's circles that you have a Doris Wishman and you have Leni Riefenstahl. I think it's just interesting and really odd, and maybe especially the Doris Wishman. But what happened, I think, in the 90s is enough time had gone by that people could sort of read the films in a new way. That, like, even now, with another 30 years have gone by, and we're still thinking about Doris Wishman. I mean, there's something really interesting about the culture, theoretical culture, but also just our mores and what we understand about film and how we're viewers, that has evolved into a certain place where we can see Doris Wishman films that maybe people couldn't before in earlier times. Anyway, maybe if I'm wrong, you should say something.
Well, I'm just going to say one more thing about Doris.
I don't just to be like all historical.
No, that's what you're here for. So, as far as Doris's work, I mean, she really didn't think that anybody cared about these movies. You know, that when she quote got rid of them or whatever, and she wasn't really, you know, able to appreciate how much, you know, beloved she was until like the late 90s, early 2000s, before she died, unfortunately, when she started doing screenings, and there'd be people in the audience and people wanting to meet her, and, you know, she was an important person in, you know, genre film fandom. So that's one thing that's kind of sad, is that a lot of these people posthumously get the attention that they deserved all along. So,
Agreed.
Yeah, just to your, I guess, okay, so I agree that we shouldn't really talk about firsts or mosts when it comes to women filmmakers, but I will just say that apparently the woman that's directed the most films is a pink filmmaker, so Pinku, the Japanese softcore genre, called Hamano Sachi, who's made over 300 films, and I interviewed her, and she was also very, she kind of wondered why I was there. So there's a similarity in terms of that. And I did see an interview with Doris where someone says, a guy is like, oh, did you, as a woman filmmaker, like, do you think that being a woman made any difference? You know, the question that every woman filmmaker gets asked. And she was like, well, I don't think my films look like they're made by women, do you? So I do want to ask, I do want to sort of pick at what you both said, that, you know, it was the fact that she was a woman filmmaker, some sort of sensibility that may or may not be conscious, and I would argue that it probably wasn't conscious on her part. What was that sensibility, if you can pinpoint it or describe it?
Well, the first thing that Doris would say was that she was not a woman or a female filmmaker. She was a filmmaker. Okay, that's what she wanted to be known as. She was also not a feminist. And what's interesting is that women who, were from her generation, they associated feminism with, like, no bras and hippie chicks and, women who don't shave their armpits. I mean, that unfortunately was what, a lot of that generation thought of feminism. But unconsciously, she made feminist films. I mean, 90% of the time, the protagonist is a female. I mean, her story may not end well, but it's still from a woman's point of view. But she definitely, what's funny is, when you look at her whole body of work, you wonder, what her feelings were about, her gender. And she comes off as very indifferent, to the women in her films. I mean, it's not like you don't feel like she really cares about any of them so much. I mean, she tells a story, and most end badly, and it's kind of just matter of fact. And it's been publicly said by Doris Wishman that she didn't really like women. She preferred to hang out with men, and which is unfortunate. She did like Peggy, though. So, go figure. But anyway, I'll let you talk.
Well, it's really hard to kind of unpack the movies in terms of their womanliness or whatever, because you don't want to essentialize anybody in this context. But I often, there's a way the point of view on the females, even with the cruelty of the ruffies, with all the beating and the sort of the rape scenes and stuff, there is a way that there's a sympathy. She's sympathetic with the females. That had a lot to do with the point of view. And there's a way, with the improvisation, I think a lot of them are almost like semi-documentaries, because it's everyone's just kind of doing their thing. And there's a really weird trust and equalness between the director and the person on screen, which I think is really interesting. And I've seen a lot of footage. I kind of know how she did it. If you've seen the films, especially this, well, it's in the earlier films too, but in the sort of roughy middle period or whatever, they're shot silent or out of sync, and then she posts up stuff later. And she's talking to people constantly as the camera's running. And I've had this experience because I've listened to, well, Lisa knows this story better than I. But I have, she made a music video with a band called the Peaches of Immortality, a Miami band. And someone sent me the footage. And she's talking constantly while the camera's rolling. And she's going, okay, more lips. Look, give me, rub your tongue around your lips and give me more boob. Push your breasts up. Can you get on the floor? Can you just roll over? Now roll over faster. And she's just constantly directing. And when you look at the movies to see that kind of stuff, it's really fascinating. She has interjected herself into the footage in a way that's really, really subjective. And so it has to be, I think of that, maybe a man does that too, but it makes a man movie. But in this case, the sort of womanliness or femaleness or something about this particular woman, female, is imbued in the film in a really deep, subjective way. And I know she was unconscious of it, but it's almost like she's in the movie, but she's not. You want to talk about her talking?
I'll let Danielle. Okay, so I was fortunate enough in the last couple of years to come across some raw audio. And it was actually given to me by her biographer, Michael Bowen. And, I knew that there was going to be music cues on there for some of the films and this and that, but I had no idea that there was going to be direction. And my mind was blown. So anyway, there's Doris on audio barking out orders at her cast, her crew. I mean, it's hilarious. I mean, because you actually get a little window into her directorial style. And we included that. We have this thing here. It's a CD called Best of Doris Wishman. And some of the tracks were just so freaking hilarious that I'm like, those are going to be the bumpers for the trailers and the music cues that are in here, because nobody's going to believe hearing her say. I mean, of course you believe it, but it was just fun to hear her in her element. So yeah, she was a real character, to say the least.
I guess I kind of want to ask about the place of violence and rape in her work and how you configure that. I mean, Peggy, I guess that relates very directly to some of your work. But also, I don't know, I remember reading somewhere that a lot of the ruffies at the period, they would have rape, but that would be the sort of denouement or conclusion, whereas hers, it's really like the setup for the narrative. So I wonder if you think that maybe some of those unconscious elements came in through sort of a rearrangement of the narrative, of the storytelling, that again probably wasn't a conscious feminist statement or anything, but the way she included elements that were kind of necessary to the genre, but maybe little, how do you say this, subverted them in some very simplistic sequencing way. I was wondering if that struck a chord at all.
It's funny, I actually have never thought of it that way. Both she and Roberta Findlay made ruffies in the 1960s, and
Do you want to explain what a ruffie is?
Yeah, I'll give you a mini history of the ruffies. Around 1964, well, I'll even go back a little further, 1963. Prior to that, most of the movies that were considered adults-only films were either burlesque films, which were from the late 40s and 50s. In the late 50s, you start to see what's called nudist camp movies, which was a legal way in the United States to be able to show nudity, but not full frontal. You could show breasts and buttocks in a context in film, but there were a lot of rules. The male characters could not be touching the female characters. The women had to have some kind of a prop in front of them. See a lot of beach balls during this time period, or towels walking to the volleyball court or whatever. And that was a thing for a while. And then it evolved into what was called the nudie cuties. And this, I'm sure all of you have heard of Russ Meyer. He made the very first nudie cutie movie called The Immoral Mr. Tease. And that kind of set the precedent for what was going to be happening in the early 60s, where they were making these comedic movies with stark naked women, or very tastefully shown gals with in their birthday suits. But once again, it was in a comedic situation with a guy who is a voyeur, or he was somehow involved in a situation where he got to see naked ladies, and it was just, they were goofy. They were, my friend and colleague, Frank Henenlotter, would say, they're the stupidest movies ever made. So, but that was up until the early 1960s. There was a shift, and it is funny, it's a lot of people want to take the credit for inventing the ruffie genre, but my mentor, David F. Friedman, says it was him. And he said that the first roughie was a movie called Scum of the Earth that was made in 1963 with him and his partner at the time, Herschel Gordon Lewis. And it was a black and white film with there was a pinup girl storyline to it. But there was also like, there was a girl who was like a nice girl, and she gets kind of involved with these bad characters, and she gets roughed up. So he said that he coined the phrase the ruffies. I don't know if I believe that or not, but all these people like are always saying I did that. Anyway, but after that, in 1963, Joe Sarno, who I don't know if any of you are familiar with him, but he was a New York director who did these beautifully filmed psychosexual films. And one of the first ones that would fall into this ruffies category was called Sin You Sinners, followed with Sin in the Suburbs. He did it a few years later. There was these two guys, John Amaro and Michael Finley, who would go on to make movies with his wife, Roberta Finley. They saw Sarno's films and they were like, we want to make some films like this. And they made something called Body of a Female, which and to me, like looking back, and it's a lost film, so nobody's seen it. The only part of it that's been seen is in clips in another Amaro movie called The Lusting Hours, which came out in 67 or 68. But it recycles the footage from Body of a Female. I'm pretty sure that quite a few filmmakers saw those films, and people like Doris, people like Joseph B. Mora, who made the Olga's House of Shame, White Slaves of Chinatown, Olga's Girls movies. This kind of film just started to show up in adult theaters. And if you were in that business, and Doris was, and prior to making films, she had been involved in the film distribution business. So she was very savvy, and she paid attention, and she knew what was like good box office. Because I mean, as much as everybody wants to think that like, oh, it's art and it's this, no, it was like to pay the bills in a lot of ways for these people. It's like, pay attention, okay, this is what's going on, it's going to make us some money, this and that. So, but in like the years of the Ruffies was around, 1964 to 68. And there is a body of work that is just, I mean, it's kind of hard to, it's not very palatable nowadays and problematic. But you have to understand that they were trying to figure out at the time, like, how to make adult films and be able to show, boobs and bums, but in a more provocative way. You add violence to the mix and that happens. So, and then, the Ruffies fizzled out when they changed the obscenity laws in the U.S. Around 1969, it was okay to start showing what they called pickles and beavers. So you could show pubic hair, you could show, women's spread eagle, beaver movies as they called them. Yeah, so, but there was like a very special time, in my opinion. I hate to say it's like, the Ruffies are my favorites, and I'm a woman, and I don't have a problem with them, mainly because the violence in them is so cartoonish. I mean, it's not, because I'm one of those people, like, if I watch a movie like Saw or Hostel, I immediately have an aversion to it, and it's like, it's upsetting to me. But these movies are just done in such a silly way that, it is what they are, so.
That was a really good history. And it's true that the Ruffies, the period, 63 to 68 or 69, is not, it's not that long.
We're still making them in 69.
Yeah.
There were some people behind the wall.
Yeah. Doris went with the trends, because she moved back up to New York and she was making the nudist camp movies, and she was savvy enough to sort of switch gears there. But I think there was something deeply intuitive with her about the violence in the Ruffies. I think she took to that really well. She just was describing a problem. She was describing the problem. She didn't have a solution to the problem. And in most of her movies, the stories of the women end badly. Or there's a really fake, like, I love you, let's get married, I've been waiting for you. And, like there's that kind of false ending of security and happiness that happens in a couple of her films anyway. But it's the violence that sort of carries it's an undertow of like a dystopic sexual relations. And to me, she would never say this, but for me, it's kind of a proto-feminist position. She's very, very critical of the social order and the politics around women. Poor Meg, whatever her name is in Bad Girls. Wait, which?
Yeah, Vegas.
Yeah. She comes to New York and she really would like to get a job she really wants to support herself and get a job. And she just goes from one bad relationship to another, just kind of gets worse and worse. But she's like, I'm going to pay my own way. And, just like she left a loveless marriage and she's, just having a hard time, let's put it that way. But I think there's a way that, in that period, you couldn't show, you couldn't, that's what the violence came in, is because that was what you could show on screen, right?
Yeah. That was all you could show.
Yeah, that was all you could show. And I've made a couple of things. I made a movie called The Dead Men with Keith Sanborn, who's my partner, who's back there in the corner. And in that film, there's some rough and tumble action between the characters, and the woman in the movie is naked. They're in a bar, and she kind of dances with this guy, and then there's a scene, a kind of a weird ritualized sex scene on the, in the bar on the floor. And I think for me, the sort of rough and tumble sexuality, like I didn't want to make a penetration film. It wasn't about that. It wasn't about pornography, but it was about the kind of jostle and tussle and fight between the sexes. So that's just how I portrayed it. And you might see it as violent, but I think of it as more athletic, I guess, in some ways. And I think of it as a game, a kind of power relationships between the males and the females.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned the rough and tumble thing, because one of the things that you'll see in a lot of the mid-60s Doris Wishman films is like scenes on the, it's like, a passionate embrace ends up on the floor and they're just rolling around and making out, and they don't actually do anything, but it's very strange. It's almost like erotic wrestling or something. So
yeah.
You kind of mentioned, in the Ruffies, the sort of, the feminist, I think what a lot of women respond to in those films is a sort of idea of a girl leaving a relationship or whatever and coming to the big city and trying to make it for herself. And you were talking earlier when we met before the screening. What is this? No, a Q&A? No, a talk. Sorry, it's Aperol Spritz. I'm not used to it. You were talking about New York as a location in her films, and obviously her films aren't really about location, but I am interested in this New York that we see, which is often in Central Park, or a woman walking down the sidewalk with her suitcase. And I don't know, I guess a lot of this stuff is really sort of the bits that don't matter necessarily in these films, because they're not the bits that were necessarily the components of sexploitation film. They were sort of the A to B of those scenes. But this is what I guess we're all interested in, is the sort of motifs and the sensibility that she brings, that she wasn't really necessarily conscious of, or that she wasn't making the films purportedly for. So I was wondering if you guys could speak a bit to the place of New York in those films, if that's something that you're interested in or would like to.
So there were only a few cities that Doris worked in. The earlier nudist films were mostly shot in Florida. In the mid-'60s, she started making films in her hometown in New York. She lived in Queens at one point, but she lived in Manhattan when most of those films were made. And then she moved, she was a snowbird, so she went back and forth between Florida, but she also did some movies in Las Vegas. As far as New York goes, she lived on East 48th Street, which was near Central Park. It was near the UN Plaza buildings, and she used her neighborhood. The one thing I will say about Doris is she was resourceful. She was working with small budgets, so she used her own apartments, her friends' apartments, the actors' apartments, and the environment that she was making the films in. So that's part of the reason that you see so much of New York. And it's almost like Central Park is a co-star in most of the films. So many start out with, or like in the middle, there's like really long, hard, serious conversations on park benches a lot in these films, and while they're talking, you'll see the characters, and then all of a sudden, you watch the camera go to a squirrel running across the thing, or you hear sights and sounds of the park there. Also, the hustle and bustle of city streets, and one of the things that we were talking about as far as the feminist female aspect is, so many of those early ruffies that she did is the story of the good girl gone bad by no fault of her own, mainly because, she came to the big city with hopes and dreams, and they were quickly dashed for whatever reason. And like so many women have had to do, I lived in New York City, I know, I had to do it. It wasn't a prostitute or anything, but I did some, I was a go-go dancer, I'll come out and say it. Women use their bodies to be able to survive, and that's what the characters in her films do. So that's where, New York is an interesting place for that, because so many people do go there with aspirations that are instantly dashed. So,
I think you covered the New York. That was good. I have nothing to add.
I guess you mentioned the pan to the squirrel, and I'm kind of interested in. I'm interested in the sort of stylistic elements that either were. At one point in this interview, she talks about using some footage just because she needed the extra footage to make up the time. So she reused some of her old footage, or she used some found footage, and obviously these are really interesting things. I guess as an experimental filmmaker, or as an audience that isn't necessarily a genre film audience, or an audience that knows so much about the landscape that she was working in. I think some of the things that I'm really fascinated by are the sort of her interest in objects, her reuse of footage across various films, like self-citation. I think that's really fascinating. And I wondered what the sort of stylistic elements, I guess especially Peggy, given that your impulse towards her is maybe more cinephilic, or maybe doesn't come from a place of interest in the genre. I'm wondering what you think are some of the elements of her sort of more idiosyncratic elements of her work, and basically.
Yeah, I'll take that. I thought about that quite a bit. There is this way that the movies are collages, and they're pieced together. Sometimes they could have been more successfully pieced together with just a little bit of attention to editing and to the kind of shots she was getting. But the fragmentary nature of them I always found kind of fascinating, because it's like a haiku logic or something, where you can kind of skip around, you can fill in the gaps. Like, we all know enough about narrative to either believe it or just love that it's weird, that she's not doing a normal narrative and she's not following. It's almost like Doris never really cared for narrative. She had to hang the characters on some structure, and so it was like, okay, you're going to go to the city, you're going to get, this is going to happen, but we need a rape scene, so you're going to go to this place and put your suitcase down, there's going to be a rape scene, or you're going to go see this guy because you think he murdered your mother, but we need a sex scene here. Okay, so then, well, how's a sex scene? But it's the fragmentary nature of them I find completely fascinating. And she made, a number of people did this in the history of sexploitation, where they would buy these films from Europe, and they weren't racy enough, so they would shoot some sex scenes and cut them in. So there's a film, she made these movies, I never saw these, The Hot Month of August and Passion Fever. I've never seen either of them, but they were two movies she bought from Greece, and she cut in her own footage into them so they'd be more racy. And it was just like, that is so postmodern or something, or just so amazingly weird to think that. And it's what experimental filmmakers do all the time, or but with different kinds of material. But there's a really interesting attitude that the film text itself is so malleable, and you can do kind of what you want with it in a really great way, and break all the rules. And I think a lot of those guys were just breaking rules all the time, and they were making a pretty good living at it.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned those Greek films, because they're obviously not the most well-known of Doris's, but one of the stories was that, and I have a little bit of a brain fog right here, but I don't know if it was Hot Month of August or Passion Fever, but literally she had the film reels with her from Greece. I guess they went on vacation there, and that was where they found them. And she left the script behind. And this wasn't in the days when you could fax over a script or email it to somebody or anything. So she made up her own story based on what the reel was. And so we don't even, like, probably isn't even the same story, but she added extra scenes, and then she just put her own dialogue and everything else to it. So not even just like, translating it from the original. That's it.
I guess I was thinking of this anecdote you told me earlier about the sex perils of Paulette, the fact that she said that it was like a Hitchcock film. Well, Wishman sort of compared herself to Hitchcock because it was the most psychological of her films.
Indecent Desires.
Oh, Indecent Desires, sorry, the dull one. Yeah, it's on tonight, it's great, one of my favourites. Yeah. But I'm wondering, in terms of this constellation of Doris, like, I read an interview where she was talking about going to see an Andy Warhol film once and how much she hated it and she wanted her money back. But I guess, maybe it's more easier to talk about those that were influenced by Doris. But I'm wondering, what sort of, I don't know, who you consider in her constellation in terms of who you might see unconscious parallels with, or
Well, she would be the first to say that, they were all original ideas. And I mean, she did write her own scripts, and the woman had an amazingly fertile imagination, because some of the stories, when you see the films, you're like a 60-something-year-old lady made, with very little sexual experience, came up with this idea, which is really pushing the envelope.
How do you know she doesn't have much sexual experience?
Oh, we know. Doris was a bit of a prude. But what I was going to say about her process that way, and Michael Bowen, I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but he is her biographer and one of the people that was closest with her at the end of her life. I mean, he had told me quite a few things, and he explained to me her filmmaking process, which was she had a cinematographer, and C. Davis Smith was her go-to guy. I mean, he was the one who made those beautiful images that you see, from the mid-'60s on. And she stood to the side. So she would be directing the film and, barking out the orders, but she didn't see what was going on behind the camera. She only saw the film footage in the editing room, and which goes to what Peggy was saying about it being like experimental films. I mean, it's very DIY, where, okay, I've got all this footage, and now I gotta make it into a cohesive story, and that's what makes the film so interesting, because it was almost like she Frankensteined those movies together in some ways. Yeah.
She wasn't a cinephile. I mean, she didn't really she saw movies, but she wasn't in love with the movies like other directors of the time were. She did tell me that she saw an Andy Warhol film and she hated it. I did hear that story. And a lot of Warhol films played in the art house cinemas, like her film, in the adult cinemas in the 60s. She probably would have seen it in a similar theater that would have shown her film. She liked Herschel Gordon Lewis.
He didn't like her.
But he didn't like her. And I think she liked Radley Metzger. Is that possible?
That would make sense.
Yeah, I mean, not that many people, and she didn't, she just wasn't that kind of person. That's, she was making, not outsiders way too strong to say, because she wasn't, but.
Like guerrilla filmmaking.
Yeah. I mean, it was kind of outsidery, I guess. Yeah. Even though she knew everybody, and they all say she had an address book to die for, but she was kind of an outsider even in her world. Like the camera guy, C. Davis Smith would say, everybody knew Doris, but no one really knew anything about her. That's what he says in an interview. And I think that was probably true. I mean, the thing to know, too, is like a lot of the credits on the films are just made up. Like, she did everything. So when it says, like, Don Whitman or something, or like, I don't know, like Louis Silverman, these people didn't really work on the films. It's all Doris. So it's like kind of a one-woman operation. She did have the cinematographer, and he had an assistant, and she had all the people in the movies, of course, and she did have someone she gives credit to as an editor. But they kind of came out of her in this way that was not within the context of the community. A lot of the other filmmakers were friends and worked together a lot, but she was a loner, I think. Am I going too far with the loner outsider thing?
No,
okay.
On the mark.
I guess you sort of bring up the fact of that she made up all these other roles and split her name across things, and that's one of the sort of things that have become quite legendary about her, as well as the fact that no one knows her birthday. There are various little things, like the fact that the dates of her films are all wrong, but that's partly to do with the cataloguing. And so I'm wondering, you both met Doris, obviously, and I'm wondering, obviously, there was a lot of like self-myth-making in terms of the way she interacted, or sort of interfaced with the world. And so I'm wondering whether you sort of, when you interacted with her that first time, I'm thinking particularly of Peggy's encounter with her in the 90s, like, were you trying to sort of get to the real Doris, or were you interested in her way of playing, or what were you expecting and what did you receive when you actually met her?
Oh, I had talked to her on the phone quite a few times before I went to Florida. And I had met her through this guy, Tom Smith, who was this local musician who's kind of a really interesting, wacky guy. And he took me to the Pink Pussycat Boutique where she was working when I went down. And initially, not necessarily in that interview, because she was really taken off guard, but then like the first time we sat together and talked, she told me almost verbatim the same answer she gave that's in the Research Incredibly Strange Films interview with her. And I was just like, she's telling me exactly those same things. She's told a million times. And I said, that's not very fresh. But as I hung out with her and got to know her, she got much more personal and kind of opened up. I learned a lot about her. Not as much as Michael Bone, her biographer, but she would open up. But I was totally fascinated by her fictional sense of self. Her the self that she had invented. It was totally fascinating and interesting. And she was in an industry where you had to lie a lot. In the films, you couldn't say you made them, or maybe you didn't want to claim them. People lied about their age. A lot of the women in the movies, probably their relatives didn't know what they did because they were maybe strippers or go-go dancers or something. And I think it was an industry where, people would move around. If you had a bad experience with one director, you just go change your name and go work for another person. Often pseudonyms in the films. I mean, it's if you have to go back and think about the grindhouse era and how people were, the makers themselves and the performers were very vulnerable.
And speaking of the actors, Doris, when she first started making movies, she was doing it down in Florida at the nudist camps. And I don't know how familiar you all are with nudist camps, but there's not a lot of glamorous people there. There's just people who want to be out in the sun naked. So the pinup photographer, Bunny Eager, who used to, she did stuff for Playboy, she was extremely well known, she would pepper Doris's films with attractive models, women who were pinup girls or whatever back then. But in the 60s, when she started making movies in New York, she started working with a group of people who almost everybody else in her orbit was working with. So you see these really familiar faces. Probably the most prominent is one of our favorites, Darlene Bennett. She's a dark-haired woman, very, very sexy and got a lot of personality. There was just a whole slew of them, and they were basically like her stock players for a number of years. And it's not until she switches over to the color movies that she starts working with a new batch of people. So, but in the sexploitation film business in the 1960s in New York, in particular, there was the go-to people there, and they played all kinds of different roles in other people's films. Barry Mahon was one of her colleagues, and he made really dumb movies for the most part. He did make a couple of ruffies, but all of those same girls are in his films, but it's a much different context. So.
Before we turn over to audience questions, I kind of wanted to ask about this current period of recuperation, this new interest in her work, and I wanted to ask what you can maybe put that down to? Like, is it an interest in sort of finding women filmmakers from all areas? I know that obviously right now we're in this period of like excitement of, I don't know, rediscovery, which I am really skeptical of, and also Doris Wishman is quite interesting because she's always been there, but like we maybe haven't looked for her. She's like a very, very invisible, if that makes sense. But also, I guess like where do you, what do you put this down to, if anything? I know it's a difficult question to answer, but that's one for Peggy, and then the other one for you, Lisa, is how if you can maybe talk about the institutions that are now interested in her work, and I guess working on the restorations with the genre film archive, but also the fact that that you can now find them on Kino Lorber and Criterion. It's a completely different audience. It isn't necessarily a genre audience, and why you think that might be.
I think people are so used to like the formulas of filmmaking. Most work is really boring. That the same story is recycled. And remember when Pulp Fiction came out, everyone was all excited because it had a new form. And whatever, okay, they moved around some scenes or something, or they intercut, different things. But I think Doris continues to be refreshing in a way with all of us not cynical, but we're overeducated film viewers.
And as far as Doris's work on, physical media, I mean, like I said, Something Weird released everything on VHS, standard definition in the 90s. Around the year 2000, we started a deal with a company called Image Entertainment, and that was the new format, DVD, and it was like the first time that Doris's films in particular were out on like consumer DVDs that were in very retail, so I mean like popular retail stores. I mean, in America we had Tower Records, Borders, all different places where like the average person coming in to like maybe buy a video is like, what is this? Because there was all kinds of weird stuff there that wasn't there before. And I think it was like in the late 90s, early 2000s that like we definitely heard people talking about her more. I mean, because she was still kind of an anomaly before then. And, those things were in print for 20 years. And this last couple of years, I work very, very closely with America Genre Film Archive. They're one of my partners, and Jimmy Maslin, who owns those films, is one of my best friends, and I just was like, people want these, like, restored versions of these films, and it's time. So we started doing the restorations for theatrical about 2 years ago, maybe even more than 2 years, because it was before COVID. And to have people be able to see these films in theaters and in cinemas was huge because they were gorgeous. I mean, I did a thing at UCLA right before the pandemic where we showed Nude on the Moon, and it was funny. I actually brought those weird little like Martian antenna things. I made everyone in the audience wear those while they were watching it, and it was funny to see that Doris's movies, which were considered like bottom of the barrel sexploitation films, being shown at these prestigious places. I mean, being invited to a film festival, all of these types of things. Like, I don't think she ever could have imagined. I mean, she probably did. I mean, it didn't happen in her lifetime. So what we're doing now with the restorations of the films that you're going to see here this week, there's also some more. They're coming out on Blu-ray. And this week we just made an announcement that we're doing the films of Doris Wishman, The Twilight Years, which is the color films from 1969 to the mid-70s, are just now being released on Blu-ray. The next set, I mean, I'm not supposed to say this, but I'll tell you guys. The next set's going to be the mid-60s ones. We're calling that the Moonlight Years. And then we're doing the nudist films and the nudie cuties. And there's all kinds of really wonderful writing and special features and things that are related to this stuff that I think is going to really bring a lot more attention to Doris's work. But I mean, I'll tell you the one thing that has helped is the Criterion Channel. I mean, when they licensed that stuff for streaming, I mean, we were laughing like, who would have ever thought? So it's a really, I mean, been telling everybody, 2022 is the year of Doris Wishman.
And on that note, does anyone have any questions? I think we have 10 minutes or so. The setting's really funny. I feel like we're on a tennis press conference or something at like Roland Garros, Wimbledon. So, anyone in the back?
There's someone way in the back.
No, she was waving at her friend.
Maybe we should talk about the movies that are coming up this week.
Peggy's partner. Come on, you must have a reserved question.
It's Meg Kelty.
Thank you.
No questions, Sam.
Okay. I mean, I could go again.
Or comment.
Oh yeah, he has one now.
It's kind of a comment more than a question.
Oh, no.
but I think one of the reasons why Doris's work has been sort of taken up by film theory and feminist film theory is that feminism has grown larger and it can expand into a larger range of thoughts, and it can allow for contradictions and complexity which weren't really there in the
Keith is saying that the reason Peggy thinks it's not a bad thought. The reason why it's been taken up by feminist film theory is this, I think this is what I heard, is that it allows for complexities that. Were you saying that early feminist film theorists weren't interested in, or were you saying that in terms of contemporary work that was being made at the time that Wishman was working? Which one were you saying?
There wasn't a lot when she was working, but I'm just saying that feminist film theory has expanded and consolidated itself enough that it can allow for contradictions. It doesn't have to be so narrowly focused, and it can take on more complex kinds of interrogation.
Yeah. The idea that feminist film theory can take on more complex interrogations now, I think that's definitely true. But I think there's lots of people also speaking to, I don't know, we haven't talked about her use of queer sexualities, of transness, which might now, obviously her trans film, Let Me Die a Woman, is, I hate the word problematic, but this would be used, very problematic in many ways, but also very empathetic, and yeah, I don't know, it's kind of...
You've got to assume that back then, I mean, it was quite a thing for her to make that movie, but at the same time, there wasn't the correct verbiage for things. Like, we didn't know what transgender was. I mean, they keep referring to the characters as transsexual, which is obviously not the case. But once again, I mean, one of the things we didn't talk about was that a lot of Doris's films are gimmick oriented. I mean, that was her thing. She thought of a gimmick and then she made a film. And came up with a title, made a film. And I mean, sadly in that case, it was, okay, nobody's made a film about transgender people, because that's what the film is about. The weird thing, it kind of harkens back to the sex educational films that were made especially in our country, in the US, during the 40s all the way up until the early 70s, where like you would have the situation where you're talking about VD or pregnancy or cesarean birth or test tube babies or something, and there would be like what was called a square up at the beginning, which was for like educational purposes, so that you could actually talk about something sexual or show naked people. It's like, well, this is for educational purposes. And I think that Let Me Die a Woman kind of falls into that category, because one of the things that happens with those other sex ed films is that you've got actual information, like there's a sex change operation in there, and you've got documentary style filmmaking, but then there's like these fake fictional things inserted into the narrative. And that happened. That was something that was going on for many, many years, and because obviously you want to entertain as well as educate. But I think that she, in that case, I mean, she knew this. She knew who Kroger Babb was. I don't know if any of you do, but he was like this legendary showman in the mid, 50s. Well, he did it from the 40s to like the early 70s. But that was his thing. I mean, he would do these films that were. Either sex educational or they, were some kind of thing that was supposed to teach you something, but with like the stuff all around the like message. So I think that's maybe what she did in this case.
I was telling Lisa the story yesterday, but I did a lot of work on this, a lot of research on this woman, Zelda Suplee. And she's that runs the camp in Diary of a Nudist. She's the woman who runs the camp with the sunglasses on and gives the main character her cabin. And Zelda was ran a lot of nudist camps in Florida and was Doris's liaison, if you want to call it that, to start making those films there. And Zelda is another untold story, kind of an amazing, amazing person. And later in her life, she worked with transgender people. And in a situation, I was looking it up, it's called the Erik Erikson Center for Transgender Studies. This is in the 70s. And she did a newsletter for people who were transgendering. And she was very active in a compassionate way with people that were transitioning. And I don't know this for sure, but it seems there's a missing, maybe Michael would know this, but it seems there's a missing piece of information that would link Doris and to Zelda with Let Me Die a Woman. Because it only makes sense that would be the connection. And it's a whole new territory for Doris, and it's a really odd transition from nudist camps to transgender advocacy, but that's kind of what happened to this woman, Zelda.
Anything else? Anyone? You must have a question.
No, I think we're good.
We're around if anybody wants to.
Okay, yeah, well, they're going to be around. And the Immortal 3?
So we're doing the Immoral? So the movie at 7:30 is The Immoral 3, which is the third installment of the Chesty Morgan trilogy without Chesty in it, though. And then it's followed by both Peggy's and my favorite Doris Wishman film, Indecent Desires, which you must see. So.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.